Lutz, the Drake Group Education Fund Webinar Administrator. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 57th edition of the Drake Group Education Fund's Critical Issues in College Sports webinar series. Today's webinar topic is the new enforcers, the College Sports Commission, MMR Titans, and the battle for oversight. Before we start, I'd like to share some important housekeeping instructions. First, everyone who registered received an email yesterday letting you know that closed captioning is available for those with hearing challenges. At the bottom of the screen is a CC button. Simply click on that button to activate closed captions. Second, while the first half of the program will be a discussion among panelists, in the second half, our panelists will field questions from the audience. Please note the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This function is now open for you to enter questions. And of course, the moderator will select questions on subjects not covered during the first half of discussion. An important note, we don't allow anonymous attendees to attend the webinar. Similarly, we don't permit anonymous questions in Q&A. We expect all questions asked will be respectful. If this is not the case, we reserve the right to remove the question and the attendee from the session. Finally, if you have never attended a Drake webinar, one of the features of this series is our distribution of Q&A and follow-up notes to all registered participants. The notes provide answers to questions we weren't able to cover during the program. And now I'm delighted to welcome Julie Sommer, the Executive Director of the Drake Group Education Fund, who will introduce our moderator.
Welcome to the 57th webinar of Drake Group Education Fund. Our mission is to provide fact-based information and expert insights to ensure college athletes can fully realize the promise of a college degree while excelling as both students and athletes. Webinars like this allow us to share new ideas, challenge our thinking, and stay ahead on critical issues. We are incredibly grateful to our panelists for sharing their time and expertise, and to all of you for joining us today. Please note the views expressed by our speakers are their own personal opinions and do not necessarily reflect official positions of their respective employers or organizations. And now let's meet our moderator and panelists. I'm honored to introduce the moderator of today's program. Please meet our moderator, Matt Brown. Matt is the brains behind Extra Points, the definitive newsletter on the business of and off-the-field issues surrounding college athletes. He's an author and the creator of Athletic Director Simulator 4000, an innovative game used by thousands of students that brilliantly captures the strategic challenges and multi-layered responsibilities facing today's college athletic directors. He knows everything, works around the clock, and he's joining us today from Chicago. All yours, Matt.
Thanks so much, Julie. I wish I could agree that I know everything. If I did, this would be a very different panel and conversation. Thankfully, though, I don't, but I'm joined by several individuals here who know lots of things that I don't, which will be helpful as we dig into a both complicated and I think particularly germane topic today. I know that when we all registered for the webinar, you received our panelists' biographies, but let me very quickly introduce everyone before we get started and thank them for contributing their time and their specific expertise. We'll quickly go down the list here. Joining us first is Robert Bob Boland, the professor of law at Seton Hall University, a nationally recognized sports law professor and practitioner and repeated Extra Points interviewee. Thank you for joining us today, Robert. We are also joined by Chris Hoppy, the partner of the collegiate practice at Excel Search and Advisory. Before joining Excel, he was a deputy athletic director at the University of Pittsburgh. Wonderful. We are also joined by Kelsey Nicole Nelson, aka KNN. She is an award-winning DC-based sports journalist, educator, and currently serves as the host and reporter for Fox Sports Radio, studio host to the Atlantic 10 Conference, and the color analyst for My American University women's basketball team. I went there for a little bit before transferring. Still love AU. And also joined here today by Barbara Osborne, professor of law at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where Osborne teaches sports law at the UNC School of Law and leads the graduate program in sports administration. Wonderful. Thank you all again for being willing to spend some time here. We'll have the initial portion of this conversation will be from some questions that we've all prepared ahead of time, and then I will also welcome questions and Q&A here from the audience, which then I'll be happy to relay here to our panel. And maybe we can start here with Barbara, actually, and then and for a lot of these questions, by all means, since I'd love to hear the perspectives of the rest of our panel here as well. But I'd like to start with maybe defining some terms up ahead, as we are going to talk about MMR companies and talk about the CSC and talk about this major regulatory questions here. Barbara, can you maybe start by helping us understand what an associated entity is, why this keeps appearing in every pitch email that I get over the last 2 weeks, and why anybody here listening should care about what an associated entity is in this context. Maybe we could start from there.
Okay, an associated entity is simply an organization that is affiliated in some way with the university. So historically, like once all of this stuff blew up, and NIL was a thing, then collectives popped up really quickly, right? Collectives are an associated entity because they're working on the behalf of the institution and doing things that directly, impact the athletics department. The MMR, multimedia rights holders for universities, are also associated entities in the sense that they have a contract with the university to provide certain services. And a lot of the MMRs are actually embedded with staff and stuff that are actually within that school even to fulfill the obligations that they have under their contracts.
Okay. So I appreciate that when we have the MMR companies, they might literally sit in the athletic department in this building. They're going and they're chasing down sponsorship deals in part here. Why then would somebody who is not a multimedia rights sales professional, why is the definition or the one of these companies being defined as an associate entity? Why is that important for any of us? What does that mean in the context of NIL?
Right. So the associated entity part really became a thing, so to speak, or at least a newsworthy thing, with the creation of the CSC and then the NIL Go portal. Because when the deals that are going into the portal get evaluated, if an organization was perceived to be an associated entity, then there was sort of this other level of scrutiny relative to whether or not the market value was legitimate or if it was sort of this contrived market. And when I say contrived market, I'm sort of referring to how collectives had sort of created their own market, right? If you looked at some of the industry reports, collectives were the largest portion of the NIL industry, and the amounts that they were paying were nothing like most third-party deals would be. And so that's why with the creation of CSC and NIL Go, those associated entity deals were really scrutinized for the purpose of making sure that they were market value type deals. There's also sort of a secondary but seriously legally important reason for being an associated entity, but you don't have to be an associated entity. You just have to sort of be affiliated or working with the university, and that deals with Title IX. There have been Title IX appeals to the House settlement. There are Title IX lawsuits pending, and in the objection to CSC and how they're operating NIL Go, there's also been a Title IX attorney who has filed an opinion relative to whether or not the Nebraska athletes were associated entities. And Title IX applies because third parties can't do anything on behalf of the university that the university itself can't do. And so the lack of equity that we're seeing in this marketplace now is a Title IX issue. And so this associated entity issue is also then a Title IX issue.
I appreciate that, Robert. Let's kind of pull on that thread here a little bit as somebody who I know you have and Chris too have some perspective, in, outside, and around this whole ecosystem. If I'm understanding Barbara correctly, and there is potential increased legal risk exposure to delegating some of these kind of deal solicitation and execution, duties to a third party or an MMR company. Why would a school want to do that instead of doing all this stuff themselves? Why bring in Learfield or Playfly and risk some of this exposure at all?
Well, because they can't do it themselves legally. And the second part is because they don't have the outreach and capability to do it themselves. So, both practically and legally speaking, um, and as Barbara pointed out correctly, we've never come to a really good understanding of Title IX and how it relates to NIL. But basically, my view, and maybe it's a maximalist position, is that any money that crosses the threshold of the campus or goes out through a contractor is countable in the Title IX analysis. There are a number of ways maybe to parse that and slice that more liberally than I am, but I sort of think if it comes across the threshold, that's one of the issues. And because in the last iteration, I think we're on version 4.0, maybe moving to version 5.0 at least or 4.5 at least the Big 10 and the SEC right now. The House settlement put in place limits as to what an institution could spend on rev share in NIL. That was exempt from CSC scrutiny at least contractually. But what's happened is in a very inflationary first year, every school in the major conferences have exceeded that $20.5 million. I said that right, it's $20.5 million cap, blew through it, if you will, in a lot of ways, and are finding new ways to pay. And the MMR partners are the logical people that you're turning to because they have the ability to do and source deals with your community, people who are already existing sponsors, people who are interested in being your sponsors, and create what would be real NIL philosophically. But if they're deemed an associated or an affiliated party, then all that would come off the table, and you'd have to find people who are entirely disinterested in your athletes to go do these deals with. And we've put a lot of rules in place, and I'm trying to write a book on NIL, and it's been 4 years under contract, and it's not done yet because they change it every year. I also advise a bunch of athletic directors in this. They don't understand this because it's very different than the way it started. But each of these mechanisms are self-created policing mechanisms to try to contain or constrain the top spenders without providing any benefit to the middle or bottom spenders. So we're always trying to define NIL in a particular way, and the top spenders are always trying to find a way around that rule, if you will.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to add anything?
I was going to jump on that. Yeah, no, great
Please.
summary by Robert to start. What I would say is that, the shift into an NIL-based sort of market economy, right? The ability to go directly to athletes and provide compensation beyond a scholarship, very new to the marketplace on a legal side. We'll put the bad actors aside for a minute. I think that though it creates a really direct, an A to B of cash to success that we've never seen before. And it was pretty foreseeable that we were going to have an above cap spending sort of mechanism of some nature. Of course, I think that the settlement was anticipating that to be what the people have termed real NIL, or sort of direct sort of company business to athlete and for set sort of expectations. But I think simultaneously, we needed to go back a year. And what we watched as many of the collectives wound down, maybe they were carrying pretty heavy balance sheets that they had accrued through development resources and whatnot. I even remember speaking to colleagues who were saying, "Okay, we're about to create a bubble here, because there's going to be a rush. There's going to be a rush to inflate this market, if nothing else, just because the collectives were winding down, they were flushing resources, but also because it to do that in an aggressive way created some of the most." I mean, the most highly paid rosters we've ever seen. Not that we have a lot of history of paying rosters, but the highest paid we've ever seen. And now, with that inflated market, we are dealing with a world of agents, athletes, coaches, parents, et cetera, who just came through a year of spending that was wildly unprecedented. And now we have to manage that market. And whether it's just market economics or even legal ramifications of saying, "Hey, Matt Brown, you were worth $3 million last year, but this year we're only giving you 500,000. I mean, I know, right? It's a challenging sort of narrative to spin. And so I think that the MMR companies, they serve two great purposes. One, they're connected to the business side the way it seems like they should be. They're also very intimately connected to the universities, to Barbara's point, to the point where it's hard to divorce them from Title IX in some ways, or at least a court's going to need to figure that out.
Sure.
And I'm going to just add a little aside, having a background in pro sports. This was repeated across every sport that went to a salary cap. They always overpaid certain positions. In football, they went to overpay the quarterback. Then they went in hockey, it was the goaltender. In basketball, it was star players. And the Moneyball trend and analytics somehow brought this back. We're still in that first wave in college sports where we're overpaying. And in this case, we're not just overpaying certain positions, we're overpaying everyone. And everybody wants to look at the convenient excuse of money, but I think your top programs are not doing it off money alone. They're doing it off cohesion, coaching resources. So the idea that we're sort of still in this false narrative that it's all about the money and we need a gazillion more is really a false narrative. No one's had the courage or the ability to point to the success backward, although I'd probably say Kirk Cignetti in 2 words as an example of that, probably the best possible part of it. So this is not unforeseeable. The colleges have done it a little bit worse than the pros did, and they did it with revenue that they need to operate on. So knowing some people haven't spoken, I'll get out of having made that point, but I'm saying the next big wave, if we can get smarter about this, is how do we pull this inflationary trend back? But it probably won't be done through the CSC, and it probably won't be done through legislation.
Well, I appreciate that thought, and this is actually something I wanted to ask Kelsey about, because in her position, I would think that she has access to coaches and to programs and proximity to coaches and programs that are a little bit different, maybe some of the ones that Robert and Chris and we have all been alluding to here. I know as a reporter, not everybody in the A10 is dropping $21.5 million on a basketball roster. I've been to some of those schools. They don't have $20 million, period. And God bless American University. I know they don't. I have been to Bender Arena. That's not a $20 million roster kind of facility. I'm wondering if you're able, and it's okay if you can't hear, but I'm wondering, Kelsey, if you could maybe tell us a little bit about some of the kind of conversations that you've had in the industry, maybe around institutions that are navigating all of these challenges perhaps differently than somebody in a P4 league that has a $60 million television contract.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate you showing love to the smaller conferences, Matt, because I think, right, like immediately when we have these conversations, right, everyone's eyes goes to the SEC and Big 10. I think luckily for me in my position, especially as it relates to historically Black colleges and universities, I've had recent talks with athletic directors and kind of smaller MMRs like Van Wagner, who obviously isn't like the Learfield or Playful of the world, with the SWAC as well and the HBCU sports and really how they're trying to navigate, this and actually as it relates to MMRs and really relying on an app. They're going to SWAC TV. So I think it's really interesting. I think the biggest thing is everyone's trying to keep up, but it's hard. And we know right now, the money is, winning, right? I mean, we know what the tournaments do for schools, especially those smaller schools. And then, of course, I know we'll probably talk about this in more in depth, but of course, the women's sports, right? It also comes, into parallel. The Title IX conversation came up earlier. And I think we keep having these conversations, but you said it, Matt, like nobody knows yet, like what to do. And I think these collectives have been great. I think something interesting, Matt, about the collectives, actually, from a journalism standpoint, a lot of former journalists now are getting tabbed, actually. Pick their resources, use their resources, and actually getting hired into the collective space. Obviously, journalists naturally, have resources out there, and obviously like sponsorships and stuff like that, just from the natural relationships. So I do think that's interesting. And then obviously having a journalist's mind when it comes to, some of the money that will come in as you think about, signage and, IPs, intellectual property, and all these other things, can be valuable. But again, I think the smaller conferences are still like trying to figure out how do we recruit? How do we make the money, especially locally? I know the big conversation when they opted in to the revenue sharing that Robert talked about, okay, we've opted in, but like, how do we make this plausible? So all that to say, I think it's real time. Athletic directors are facing hard decisions. I mean, and athletes are coming to them, and now athletes again, they really don't know who to come to. I think this is why we're also seeing a bunch of financial advisory firms, start to flood, the space. They're trying to educate, but still, there's no answer. So all that to say, I really do hope the smaller conferences and schools, do get a say. You said it; they don't have the budgets. But they still want to provide, a great athletic experience for these student athletes, and collegiate athletes. But it's hard. So it's been really interesting. But yeah, I think the MMRs and especially the smaller ones and how they're trying to kind of infiltrate has been interesting to watch. And I think also the smaller schools also just aren't relying on the media rights deals, for television, especially with the way that all of us are watching games now, right? Like you have to really remember how to watch a lot of these games now because they're so accessible on so many different digital platforms. But I do think there's going to be an interesting conversation as it relates to digital media rights, as we kind of continue this forward as it relates to media and media rights.
Sure. I appreciate that. And I'd like to follow up here. And if any of the three of you have perspective on this, I'd be interested as well. But I know from my own reporting, from talking to Patriot League or A10 or even some HBCU institutions at the lower end of budgets, what was not uncommon for those institutions to not have an MMR partner at all and decide, well, I'm in DC or I can reach an affinity-based audience. I can do this myself. And I've talked to some institutions that make substantially more than they would over a 300 grand guarantee. I'm curious now that we're talking more about MMRs playing a much more aggressive role in deal solicitation and generation. Have you heard anything about any of this changing a school's interest in working with an MMR company as or the calculus for partnering versus doing it in-house?
I think you're exactly right, Matt. I think a lot more athletic departments, especially as we're seeing some downsizing, they are looking to do things in-house again with how we watch these games. I mean, I'd ask anybody in the audience, how often are you watching A10 or Patriot League games, right? And MMRs, I mean, rightfully so, they can bring in a lot, but they can also take a lot. And these schools are trying to use every dollar that they can for every resource that they can. A lot of the schools that you mentioned, they are trying to save funds for new athletic buildings on campus. As we all know, those cost a lot of money, but they're really important, for recruiting. American's a perfect example with the new facility on their campus that athletes are able to use. And then of course being in a big city, right? Like schools in DC are going to be much, much different, than schools, I don't know, like in the middle, like of Iowa.
Bonaventure, right? Yeah, middle of nowhere. Yeah.
Or let's say anywhere the Big 10 hasn't touched. It's going to be very, very, very much so different, for those schools. But yeah, I think in-house, and this is why, especially, and I think maybe this is the one maybe positive for young people. I think we are seeing more jobs in that sense. They are trying to really try to figure out again how to reach that like digital space, how to bring people in. I think the app space again, so many people are trying to figure out how do people are already on their phones? How do we keep you on your phone? How can we make it cheaper? And I think that's going to kind of be the way that these smaller schools are going to try to compete as much as they can with recruiting. Because think about it, when you come to recruit, everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be seen. And I think it's hard to do that when you're competing against the SECs and Big Tens of the world, Matt. So I think you're right. I would highly look at all these athletic departments, and especially as they're doing their budgets, where the cuts are, but where the growth opportunities are. And we are seeing that in the digital landscape.
Athletic departments tend to be slow in transforming that way. And I think you hit on something too, and Kelsey did as well. The MMR companies were were under a lot of pressure to even meet their own demands back to their own schools. So the market was a challenge. And when NIL came, a lot of them were reticent, along with their schools, to get involved in this space. Learfield, in particular, the biggest player at the time, basically sat out the first year, along with their athletic directors. So the fact that they've come to this now is a much later process. And I was still at Penn State as athletic integrity officer, and to some degree overseeing or helping oversee our NIL implementation in that role. Learfield didn't want to play a part. Our athletic director didn't particularly want to play a part in that role. Where I thought what Learfield would be doing is setting up a lot of categories that would be official university partners. If we didn't have a hotel partner, we now had a hotel partner. If we didn't have a car dealer partner, we had a car dealer. Any category that wasn't set should have been grasped in that time. And I think that was a lost opportunity. And so the economy we're trying to grow now and fertilize is now 4 years late in creating these opportunities. And so some schools have gotten way ahead and done really well with this, and some schools have done really poorly in understanding it. And Kelsey points to like areas like storytelling, micromedia, reach to alumni. And I think if we look at NIL and how it's changed the paradigm, I'd point to Vanderbilt as a great example of that. Uh, Maybe really good coaching, maybe really good facilities, but really in a neat city that is able to embrace that, and having opened up its graduate schools more than other schools have been willing to do. So it does take a whole campus approach to understand this, and most schools haven't done that. They're still thinking, how do I pay an offensive guard, or how do I pay a basketball guard, or how do I pay a women's swimmer, and not where does this fit in the advancement of my ecosystem, and how does my MMR partner help me? They're just thinking about gross dollars right now. They haven't gotten into the actual tactical and strategic part of this. They're just sort of, how do I pay X now?
Yeah, yeah. I would second what Robert said about a little bit of a slow adoption. At the same time, I think we're seeing signs that MMR is finding some new traction there. I think Learfield's new deal with TPG has them thinking bigger ideas and roll in that world. I also think that it's interesting. I mean, my company, for example, Excel Search and Advisory, is a part of Excel Sports Management. I mean, we have lived historically on the pro side of all things really until recently, and what's been interesting is the pro side isn't living in a world of MMR partners. I mean, they develop those business relationships on their own, and right now with college, looking to fill a much larger bucket of commercial need. I think that they're weighing and measuring, okay, am I getting enough from the MMR partner to continue down that path, or should I, borrow, build, or buy? Should I build, this model for myself, because it takes a little bit of a ceiling off at that margin that you were giving previously to MMR. The last thing I would say is just when it comes to the institutions that are a little smaller, they're not hitting the cap of revenue sharing. There's just almost, I mean, their MMR decision is almost divorced in some ways from, I think, the NIL or the revenue sharing decision, in the sense that, they can pay from their university coffers anything they would need to pay to athletes. And so there's a little less of this need to try to generate a shell that's an over the cap model.
Sure.
Of course, they'd love for corporate partners to engage athletes, but it's not quite the same as how do I get above the cap, which is the big element for the biggest schools, right? That's a very different calculation.
There's operationally a very huge difference between how do I get to 40 to 50 million versus how do I get to 7, and who institutionally can pay
That's
for
right.
that.
And if I'm a $200 million athletic department versus a $29 million athletic
Sure,
department,
sure.
that 7 is a much more difficult number, right?
No doubt about it. Which I think actually speaks to one of the kind of elephant in the room questions about this here, which is governance, right? Like as we're chatting about multimedia rights and sponsorships, and I can have my other monitor open here, and I can check and say, okay, we got SEC ADs and presidents who are making noise about we need to switch to a conference specific governance model because all of us generate over $170 million a year from our athletic departments, and we've made these financial commitments. We're tired of being held down by the pores from the Big 12 and keeping us from spending what we want. And the Big 10 leadership is kind of insinuating the same thing. And you have Jamie Pollard at Iowa State, who's basically saying, I'm sick and tired of listening to you guys to make this threat. Go on and go do your own thing. What I'd like to better understand, apart from the saber rattling from the people that have been rattling sabers for as long as I've been doing this business about taking their ball and going home, I'd like to understand first from a legal perspective. So perhaps you maybe initially more from Robert and Barbara about what logistically and legally would have to happen to even do that. Because my dumb layman understanding is all of you guys signed and ratified this house settlement. And you can't unilaterally exit that and necessarily do your own thing, right? Or am I mistaken because they want to give more money to athletes?
Yeah, you are right, Matt. With the House settlement, all of the member schools of the named defendant conferences are a part of that settlement, right?
Yeah.
They can't just divorce themselves. It was mind-blowing to me. Schools aren't signing this agreement. I'm like, you don't have a choice. You are legally obligated. You agreed to the settlement. But that is when you're talking governments from a much bigger picture perspective, this is the issue that the NCAA has struggled with from the very beginning. And in the last 15 to 20 years, the NCAA has had more major governance changes than they had in their entire history, all the way before that. And every single one of these governance changes has provided more input and maybe more benefit to student athletes. But what it has done is shifted us from a completely democratic organization where you had one school, one vote, to an oligarchy where the few conferences that have the most money control all of the voting power. And so the lawsuits have followed as that shift has occurred. And the biggest problem of all is that the NCAA as a voluntary membership organization has always been the members create the rules. But the moment the members create the rules, the members are also trying to find ways around the rules. And we are seeing exactly that behavior with the House settlement. This is the settlement. This
Yeah.
is what the law says. I mean, obviously, it's still being disputed, et cetera. But you're bound to this until a court says you're not. And the moment, that happened and NIL Go was put into place, et cetera, schools did everything they could to find end runs around the cap. And as you said, this has always been to the detriment of the majority of members who don't have those resources.
Thank you. Rob, I see gears turning above your head right now. Was there something else procedural that would need to happen or have to happen or
I think there's a realpolitik inside of what Barbara just laid out is exactly the legal aspect of it.
Yeah.
That we've seen, and I live this playing at Columbia after it moved to 1AA from Division I because they didn't want pointy-headed eggheads having the equal vote to people that had real athletic departments. But one of the interesting parts about what Barbara just laid out, and I think it's fascinating, is the idea that inside the coalition we have varieties of levels of power. And I was going to say kind of humorously that the House settlement is so 2025, and it doesn't represent the real world today that other conferences, the Big 10 and the SEC certainly want to live in, and how they see their competition against their so-called group of four or Power Four peers, but against everybody else. So they're trying to reshape this NCAA governance model using the power and the gears that it has to the point that I'd say that if you look at it today, Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey rule college sports, and Charlie Baker is their vassal, even though he is the titular king. I always try to explain college sports through history of Europe and crowned heads. It seems to make the most sense to me. But I think the one of the ways that the Power Two have found, or their other compadres have found to manage this and to weaken the House settlement, is to basically say, all right, let's weaken the CSC. Let's weaken the structures that do it. And in this case, a lot like Major League Baseball in the 1980s and 90s, the Big 10 and the SEC may be behind Jeff Kessler in this arbitration to weaken the CSC that's coming up, or special master provision, and their interests no longer align. So we're in a place where governance, the interests of the parties don't align. I don't know. I don't predict a breakaway, even though Jamie Pollard, who I think is one of the smartest ADs out there, made the comment, go ahead, just break away, we'll keep the intellectual property. But I do think that these are powerful marauding forces, and I worked at both, actually. I worked in the Big Ten and I worked at the SEC, so maybe I have a bit of a justification saying this, These are powerful marauding forces that who are now operating, and maybe their bluff is being called finally in the governance model. So it is a complicated one. But I think the real politic that's going on in here is that everybody is using the chaos or the lack of definition to their own advantage. They aren't static players right now. They're all trying to gain their own advantage over each other internally while this is going on. So that's why this is so hard to bring order to.
What I really appreciate about that response was you trying to frame this in the context of something completely independent from college athletics. Warring kingdoms of Western Europe, through the various centuries. And I have been racking my brain for weeks about how to navigate really the question here that I think Barbara specifically brought up, were what do you do about a voluntary membership organization? How do you govern this when the entities that are clamoring for rules and constantly write rules and create the handbooks that then we discuss in forums like this deeply do not want any of those rules to apply to them? And then we are in many ways continuing the same battles from home rule in the 1920s. And I'm trying to think of where has something like this ever happened in any other industry or in any other system where order was eventually brought. If Robert is correct that the best comparison is West Europe, well, I'm not a student of history, but I do seem to recall there being wars and many people dying to reach some some kind of conclusion there, which I think we would prefer not to have happen in college athletics. I'm curious if any of you other three can think of any other, whether it's in college athletics or in any other industry that you can look at and think, well, these were similar issues about governance that were resolved X, Y, or Z, or any other way or model that people should be pointing to here. I've joked online before that these seem to be questions that should go to a priest rather than a lawyer, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, I actually really like Bob's analogy, but I think you're kind of getting at one of the true issues about what makes college sports unique, right? So we are trying to apply all of these rules and laws to an industry that exists within higher education, which is a highly regulated space. And in these transactions, it's not like professional sports, because professional sports deal with one sport and their whole goal is to make money for the people who own the teams, right? And that's not what the goal is in college athletics. And I mean, you don't have traditional buyers and sellers,
Yeah.
because just the relationship between the school and the athlete, they're both on both sides of that. Right. So you have this really, really unique space that you're trying to apply marketplace, et cetera, rules to, and it doesn't fit nicely.
I couldn't agree more with what Barbara just said. But I want us all to take a step back a minute, and I'm going to defend my colleagues from the industry that I spent 20 years with.
Please.
I think we don't always stop and think about we think about them as gray matter, right? That feels like they want to break rules. They want to get ahead. I think everyone wants to win. I'll give you that. But I think it's important to understand the pressures that are on these individuals now, all the way up to the top of, particularly because they carry some of the highest paid individuals in their states, the tops of their state governments are engaged in what happens, right? I think we see more and more ADs who, it's hard to tell if they're making the decisions where they are, or if it has more to do with politics and power, right, in places, and board members and governors and so forth, right? I think as well that while I always say there's haves and there's have-nots and there's have more than anybody, right? And that's a smaller number than we all realize, but their impacts trickle back down. And it puts people in really, difficult positions to try to keep up. And then, the part that maybe bothers me the most, and has even back to my days on campus, is the lack of transparency that we have about what the market really is. And interestingly, I was just at the Final Four and had a chance to catch up with, friends and colleagues who are now agents. And there's this burgeoning agent market, and they're just responding to a marketplace that has opportunity. But nevertheless, without anybody sharing any data amongst each other, we're divided and conquered. We are lacking a true understanding of what folks are being paid. And back to professional markets, we know that. You know what that is. And so there's a lot more clarity, and people can make decisions that are based upon, an understanding of what their competition is doing. College athletics, I think, is hurting itself by failing to give that transparency out. And because of that, there has to be a double-digit percentage that's being overpaid in the market to get ahead. And in reality, all anybody's trying to do is honestly not get fired because they didn't respect the market that they were in, but they don't really know the market that they're in, so it leads to decisions that are, hey, they're not always business worthy, or the business decision is just to survive.
I want to at least add a hyphen onto what Chris has said. The law firm where I hang my shingle, Shoemaker, Lupin, Kendrick, is probably the largest representative of college athletic directors. And at some point in the last 12 to 14 months, we had more firings and separations of high-profile athletic directors than we had new contracts and new athletic directors. So it is a place where the athletic directors are trying to manage in the moment and get through the day. And most of those decisions have been made around NIL, whether it's rightly or wrongly, it's the blame factor. So I'll stop at that point just to say that, yeah, they're paying the price in a lot of cases.
Oh, from all of your lips to the ears of general counsel on campuses, right? Like I'm the guy that runs a FOIA directory and publishes about operational spending all the time. If you'd like to donate to our legal defense fund so we can start to sue for more of these and revenue sharing numbers, be happy to talk to you offline, because a lot of people are trying to build that, but we can't do it if the law doesn't let us and if schools say they don't want to share it.
And Matt, we're a subscriber, so
I'm joking. I'm not here to sell anything here. This is a joke. Kelsey, there's something else that I think I heard Chris just mentioned there, which I'd love to hear your perspective on, which is the political role in any of this, right? We're hearing from institutions that want not only the federal government to potentially be more involved, but sometimes state governments. A lot of the changes that we've seen right now with how the transfer portal is regulated, with how a lot of athlete NIL regulation works, came out of state courts and state AGs. And I think all of us know on this call that lawmakers can often have a lot of influence, good, bad, or just a lot of influence on hiring decisions or spending decisions in athletics. Given all of the governance challenges we were all just talking about here, and from your perspective and from your knowledge of the institutions in your world, do you think there is a positive or healthy role for state lawmakers or federal lawmakers, for that matter, to be playing in solving some of these problems?
Yeah, Matt, I think this falls perfectly with your last question, because as everyone was talking, and especially, I think the journalist in me was just saying, like, the transparency is really what matters. I've had, journalist friends that have had to go through the open records requests. Like, a lot of this information, a lot of these universities or collectives, they don't want to share out. And usually people don't want to share out, right? There's a reason why. And so I think it's, the checks and balances. And then I mean, if everyone on this call knows as well, like the NCAA for a long time, has been questioned, right, even before NIL, as it relates to governance. And then I think this whole situation just added a whole nother level, right, for people to continue to scrutinize it. I don't think there ever will be a day where, everybody in America votes 100% on the way that the NCAA is ran and things are running. But all that to say, athletic directors, it's funny, especially like I feel like a lot of the uproar comes, a lot of the times when people find out that, the top like paid state employee might be like the football coach, in their state, there's so much madness, because people are like, well, we have teachers, who are teaching our children, and all these other great jobs and roles, obviously, that people have, that many people feel should be much higher paid. And then especially the uproar comes, right, if it's an athletic director or coach at a university that's had a losing record. Right.
Sure.
Winning kind of helps to solve all, right? I'm sure in SEC schools, maybe there's not as much uproar, about some of those schools and high paid coaches, as related to kind of maybe some other schools who have been struggling, right, with their related conferences or roles. I think the lawmakers, it's interesting. Like I know from a federal level, right, we've seen the executive orders come out. I think there's been a lot of opinions on that. Especially, I think it's kind of like reading the room. A lot of people feel like there's a lot happening in this country right now. So is this something that the federal government should take on, with all that's happening? I'd say, a lot of people maybe say, maybe not so much. But at the same time, and I know this relates to high school and NIL as well and high school athletes. But I think the states and where it lies in the states, I think it depends. I think some state lawmakers are just kind of like, hands off because sports is really the one thing, think about it, that like kind of everybody can talk about and maybe either agree upon or have a conversation about. But state lawmakers at the same time, I think they know it's so contentious because there's still so many questions about everything we're talking about. The house settlement, we're still trying to figure out. A lot of these, parents, I mean, think of a lot of the most probably popular people now in the state, a lot of times are these high school athletes, right? And their parents are well known now because of social media. These athletes are well known now. A lot of these athletes probably have more followers than a lot of these state, legislators or leaders. And so they know they have a voice or opinion. And so Matt, I think it's a hard gamble.
Sure.
But I do think everybody at the end of the day does want it to be somewhat regulated. But again, the hard part is nobody's had a good answer about as to how it really, how it should be done. But I will say, I think for the most part, people don't want the federal government, it seems like, really relaying these issues, especially me living in DC. And I see that a lot. And especially I know with what we've seen happen recently, right, with the two acts as it kind of relates to this topic that we're talking about. But all that to say, yeah, I think the state legislators, they have a hard job. State universities, public universities, with the rising cost of higher education. Barbara, you brought that up earlier. This is higher education that we're talking about as well. And we're seeing less students actually commit to college as a whole, not even just student athletes, so that whole question about if students even should go to college. So I think nobody really knows where to stand. But at the end of the day, and if your university is winning, and the legal challenges as well, like where are the legal cases coming from? You think about the states. A lot of this is challenging, Matt, and so I just think that there's no clear answer, but I think at the same time, I think the government. To me, I think it's easier for them to just kind of stay out of it, and let the schools and hopefully the NCAA do their job, right? Again, we're talking about governance, we're talking about the CSC. Like at the end of the day, that's why they were created. It's hard, but when you have too much oversight, nothing gets done. And I think that's kind of the point that we're at right now is just nothing seems like it's moving because there's too many cooks in the kitchen essentially, and nothing's getting prepared. And at the end of the day, it's our student athletes who are kind of hurting and footing the bill that no one can really figure out right now.
Thank you. What do you think, Barbara?
So I wasn't expecting that. I was actually expecting Bob to come in because he's done such cool work with like the AG stuff. But well, I think this all comes from something that was already said is like how much Americans love their sports and how college sports fans are so vested and so connected. And that includes the leaders in various positions, right? So when Chris was talking about all of the layers that happen within a university, it's not just the athletics directors making, an ethical decision about something. They're accountable to the president or chancellor and the board of trustees, and all of those people have opinions and are fans and honestly, I think everyone in America thinks that they could do a better job than the athletic director, and they have no idea what the athletic director's job is, right? And so that's the same when you're looking at the state government or the federal government, right? You've got people who are fans who think they know some things, but then like especially with the attorney generals, they aren't sitting back and saying, yeah, maybe we shouldn't touch this. They're being like fans and saying, hey, I see this as a disadvantage for us, so we're going to go after them. And it is probably a place where they should stay out. Because when you have 50 AGs that all are trying to do whatever they think is right for their flagship institutions, they're never going to agree on anything. And the hodgepodge of stuff that's coming out of it is what's making this really, really fun to research about and teach about, but a mess for the people who have to actually work and live in this industry.
Yeah, there is something to be said for all of us working at interesting times, and it's great if you are writing for a living or talking for a living. But yeah, I agree. If I was in an AD chair, I'd have more gray hair than just this, trying to navigate this. I very much appreciate all of your thoughtful answers. I want to, as I've been looking at the chat on the side here, I want to get to a couple of these questions maybe a little bit early. As a reminder to the other folks here who are on the call, if you have a question, feel free to type it in, and I'll be happy to try and share this here. I have a few that I'd be interested in all of your perspectives. This first one here comes from Krista, who asks, regarding a potential governance break by the Big 10 and the SEC to do their own thing. The recent case, I think this is Cho v. Brown, was one conference, the Ivy League, deciding for itself. If I remember this case correctly, this was about whether the Ivy League could, as a cohesive unit, decide not to offer athletic scholarships and whether that would be an antitrust violation. And if I'm remembering this right, the courts ruled that they could. What Krista wants to know here, though, thank you, Barbara, for nodding. Make sure I remembered. If the Big 10 and the SEC both land on the same cap structure, the same different regulations within a few months of each other, would that be the same antitrust situation as the Ivy League and athletic scholarships, or would that be a different question, given what kind of market cap those two conferences have?
So I feel that exact same question from the smartest person I know in sports, Frank Hawkins, today. I don't think it would be analogous to Cho, where the Ivy League was successful because they control such a small percentage of the market. I think it would be an attempt at monopolization because the Big Ten and the SEC would control all of the most elite part of the market, or at least the largest percentage of the elite of that market. And I think one of the challenges, and I say this as somebody who dabbles as an antitrust lawyer, I may only play one on television. I'm not really one, but you can't be a sports lawyer without having a pretty strong sense of antitrust. The colleges have not ever shown a propensity to operate without agreement. So ultimately conspiracy, if you will. Conferences theoretically would not be antitrust violators because none of them have such a large percentage of market share. But a breakaway SEC and a breakaway Big Ten would pretty quickly, with some apologies to Barbara's school, the University of North Carolina, and some others in the ACC and Big 12, would pretty much stratify pretty quickly, at least in terms of budget control, spending, and would ultimately probably reach agreements. It's just natural. Now, if they could do it organically, maybe they'd be okay. But I do think they would not be protected the way the Ivy League was, which had such a small market share, or maybe the plaintiffs' lawyers in Choi didn't do a good job defining how much of elite global education they controlled to do that in the relevant market. But ultimately, that would be my thought on it, that this would be a problem for them if they stratify. And who it would be a problem to them from would not be outsiders. It would be other conferences and others inside of college athletics. So one of the reasons I think the NCAA is pushing so hard for the SCORE Act is to protect itself from outsiders. That's certainly an obvious one. But to some degree, protect its power class, the cool kids table, from antitrust challenges from other lesser includeds who are being dragged along a little bit trying to keep up, whether that's the group of six, whether that's even lower level Division I programs. But the stratification is clear inside of that. And I think that's something that we're looking at. That's one of the things that for me makes SCORE so unpleasant and unpalatable, is to give such broad antitrust protection to that group. If the big guys want to fight, I'm okay with that. But if they want to pick on the little ones while they're fighting and predate against them, I'm not okay with that, because I'm like Barbara, whether she might believe it or not, in the views I'm expressing now, kind of anti-NCAA. I do see a role. I do want the survival of higher education in America as our #1 priority, regardless of any athlete gets paid or not.
Right. So, to piggyback a little bit on that, I agree with Bob in that I do think that if the ACC and SEC, or not ACC, the Big Ten and the SEC get together, that is a different thing than the Ivies, right? But there's also this aspect of the House settlement where they have agreed to follow these rules for the next 10 years. And so the fact that they're even discussing getting out of this by creating their own thing doesn't actually get them out of this from a legal perspective. Um, and honestly, Jamie Pollard's remarks the other day in D1 Ticker, right? Where it's like, fine, just, go do whatever, right? There isn't a real clear market value for them to maybe do that because they are the haves and the super haves as it was described right now. But if they aren't playing against any of the have-nots, all of a sudden half of their super haves are losers now. And that isn't probably a very tenable solution for them in the future. Plus, I mean, as Bob was alluding to, I mean, if this happens, I don't think that the schools that are in those two conferences actually remain the same because there are schools, even within each of those conferences, there are schools that just don't look like the others that probably aren't going to be able to survive in that kind of a landscape.
I appreciate that. I have another question here that is, we'll be happy to open up to all four of you because it is not explicitly legal in nature. This is from Donna, who says, "What do the panelists think about Division One not governing itself as it's a conflict of interest of the members doing it now, and instead fixing this with an independent board of directors that govern all three divisions with independent investigatory, adjudication, and arbitration processes?" So I guess if I'm understanding Donna's pitch correctly, the SEC and Big 10 and Big East and Big West presidents are no longer the governing board. It is now people that do not have .edu email addresses. What do we think about this?
Can
Chris, what do you
I
think?
can I
Please.
answer?
Yeah, please. I'd love to
Unless
hear
I'm misunderstanding the question, I'm going to stick up for my NCAA folks here. I think we already have that, and I think it's the NCAA. The NCAA is a membership body that's made up of members of those institutions, and I think is that what we're saying, or are we saying people who have nothing to do with the universities? Let me ask that clarifying question.
Well, barring any other immediate message here from our question asker, the text that I have says an independent board of directors governing all three. So I think for the sake of this intellectual exercise, let's say that these are people who are not directly affiliated with these institutions. These are not Georgia or Princeton or employees, but yes, totally independent. Thank you for the clarification. All right.
Yeah. Well, again, I feel like we're still hovering around a concept that's very similar to the NCAA. Of course, the NCAA staff, right, and a lot of the people who operate out of Indianapolis they're maybe from campuses, but they're not. In fact, they work for the NCAA membership body. They're empowered by the campuses, and I think just having been on a campus, I think we would all lose something if it was a truly and entirely independent body doing this because of many of the things that I was trying to say and Barbara kind of seconded about the layers of politics that go into those campuses. And I don't know for sure what we would gain from that. And I think a really interesting point is this, right? For years, we've kind of kicked the NCAA. Why are they so goofy? Why don't they do the right things? Why can't they ever get it right? And then we said, what's going to be great? We're going to have the CSC. And the CSC isn't going to be the NCAA, and they're going to get it right because they did. And I am a big fan of Brian Seeley's. I actually think he's got the toughest job I know of these days. I think he's doing his best and doing a nice job with what he can do. My point is this: now we're kicking the CSC, and we were kicking the NCAA, and we can make a different independent authority body, and then we're going to kick them, and it all comes back to everyone wants to win. And if the ball's going in their favor, then they're celebrating, and if it's not, then they're calling their attorney general. And the more we do this, we just sort of relive history over and over again. And I think we have to get on the same page. and not expect that there's going to be a body that's going to get us on the same page, if that makes sense.
I appreciate that. What do you think, Kelsey?
Yeah, I think Chris hit the nail on the head. I think I get what Don is trying to get to. Like you're trying to eliminate the conflicts of interest, right? But I think the hard thing is it's really hard to do that. Because one, even if you say you have somebody that's completely independent from a university, then you have to wonder, well, who's going to govern if there's any tampering, right? We're talking about schools and organizations, and there's so much money that could still be poured. I mean, I think this kind of comes up to any board conversation, right? Any governing board. I think you always try to get a wide view of opinions. It's just hard, like you said. I mean, that's why, like Chris said, that's why the CSC is created, and we're complaining. The NCAA, every time we get new leadership, folks complain. So it's hard, but I think that's kind of why we have to make the best of what we have. But I think for right now, it's just the governing bodies just aren't being. The governance we're not really seeing, right? I think I hear so much more about governance as it relates to sports betting, especially, in this space. And I think that kind of is a little bit more clear cut than what we're talking about right now, with the NIL space. So I think in a perfect world, it would be great, if everyone, stood by their ethics, didn't have any bias, and really could, be part of an independent, body or board to do this. But I just think there's just no way to do it. There's too much money involved as it relates to what we're talking to, I think, for that to kind of unfortunately be a reality.
And
Yeah.
to Barbara's earlier point, probably still too many cooks in the kitchen from a governance standpoint of the institutions themselves to allow it to be fully independent or apart. So I think I mean I had a job that was created as the result of a consent decree between the Big 10 and the NCAA and Penn State in a horrible moment. Now, I wasn't around for the creation of it. I'm the second person into that role, but the idea that attorneys general, state governments, governing boards of the institutions would still need to be heard from. There would be external laws and gravity. So it might be a solution to governing Division I practically underneath a structure, but it would be a difficult thing to put in place. And I say that with incredible respect for the person asking the question and the question itself.
I appreciate all that, Donna. What I can quickly tell you, just my own personal opinion, is I'm happy to meditate upon this more myself and think about it. I would say that I don't want to do it. I'm maybe there are other people out there who have the perfect CVs. That job sounds very difficult and very thankless, but
Hey, Matt,
interesting thought exercise.
Matt, I'm sorry to interrupt and not let you exit this question, but I also think that there's an interesting moment that the NCAA has been in a bit of an abdicated position in its own governance. It was protecting itself against the House settlement and the multi-billion-dollar loss that went with it. And really, for the last however many months, Charlie Baker has really been playing almost exclusively to Congress, seeking broad-based antitrust exemption. They really haven't, they've taken only forced governance steps along the way to protect themselves, and in the words of Blazing Saddles, keep their phony baloney jobs along the way, rather than take on real reform. This is going to sound terrible for me to say, just because I'm going to say it, but it's terrible. Mark Emmert and the Transformation Committee was more progressive in that way. I think Baker has looked entirely for a bailout from Congress. The SCORE Act itself, a giant overreach. It'll be interesting to see if Democrats take the House and Senate, how that might come back as a more pragmatic governance request, because there are probably aspects where the NCAA should have some antitrust immunity, earned antitrust immunity, not just warranted. But it is a case where I think that to think about the governance model, there's been some abdication from Indianapolis, at least in terms of active governance in the last couple of years.
I think, Bob, what you just laid out there would be another hour. And I say that like absolutely not to dismiss what you're saying in any way, but like that kind of the real politic analysis of what Indianapolis has done, should have done, what they're permitted to do, what they're hired to do. That is a great topic that I feel I do not have the ability to properly moderate within 9 minutes. But I do appreciate you planting that seed. I think we have room for one or two more. There's one that just came in here from Marquise Young that I think is super interesting, and I'd love to hear what you all think, because now I'm thinking about it. What is a possible black swan event between now and say 2035 that almost nobody is talking about, but that you think could actually force a sustainable, widely accepted NIL and college athletic model to emerge? What is the meteor that forces everybody to stop talking or relitigating the same three things? Chris, I'd love to
I
hear
have it.
yours. All right,
I've
let's
had
hear
this
it.
conversation numerous times this week. Um, for the longest time, I thought it would be student athletes sitting out of a championship, and literally passing on a Final Four or even multiple regular season football games or basketball games. I thought that that was a real possibility. Now, student athletes, depending on which cohort you're talking about, are finding themselves in a slightly different leverage position of leverage, I suppose. The one that I don't hear enough about, and I'm knocking on wood. I'm not asking for this to happen, but with all of the enrollment cliff, the universities struggling, even closing, asking for additional subsidies from the government or not getting the subsidies they once received, with still strong faculty unions in many places, and I mean the potential really of faculty in the middle of some sort of a negotiation coming to realize that they're not going to make $70,000 this year, but the offensive line's making $700,000. What if there was a work stoppage for faculty? What if they just walked out and shut universities down? I mean, if that happened, I mean that's still the golden goose. Football, while it may be the front porch, it doesn't pay the bills. It just makes sure the university is very well known for what they're doing. And I think, again, not wishing or wanting that, but I think we haven't heard from faculty yet, and I'm very interested at some point to see if we will.
That is a great example of a black swan. I'm so sorry that my camera seems to have turned off here. But that doesn't mean that we can't keep going. Do any of the other three have ideas of a potential event that we're not discussing here? The idea of athlete labor stoppages, again, like I think that's another hour and a half conversation here too. I hadn't really thought about faculty. Do any of you other three have any ideas for something that would outside of our current conversation here that would shift how we discuss these issues?
I would say that I don't have like, oh, I'm sorry,
Go
Rob.
ahead, Barbara.
I was going to say, I don't have an exact Black Swan movement, but something I'm closely following right now is the NAACP and this Out of Bounds campaign that they recently launched. I don't know if it's going to work, but if it does work, and just to give some context, if athletes actually do deny going to these public universities, in the 8 states that the NAACP called out, largely states, especially as it relates to football and schools that benefit, from those athletes' labor, I do think that could be interesting. Again, I don't know if it's going to get traction. It's gotten picked up some, I think, in the news and media, but just from athletes, I haven't heard this will be like a factor for them. But again, I think the NAACP out of bounds campaign, I think what's happening politically, I think if people are following what's happening in southern states and as it relates to voting rights and the Voting Right Act and what's kind of, again, going back to the states conversation that we're having, I think if athletes really do take kind of a more political stance and say no to those schools, and then if we have those athletes, again, start to look at other schools and options, and you think about the other conferences that are available, I do think that could have a big, profound effect. So I think there's still more to come. But I think if we see more organizations, really kind of, I guess, kind of using student athletes, I don't want to say as pawns, but that's almost kind of what we're seeing, like, because they know college athletics touches everything in every single state. So I think if you can get college athletics to really, again, listen to what's happening in the world, I do think it could be really, really interesting. But again, that's if the college athletes do have buy-in and say no, because we know if these schools, lose these top tier athletes, and Chris said it, universities are already making cuts. They're struggling in different areas, but especially if you hit their athletic department, I do think you'll start to see some I think some people trying to bend and break in any type of way to make things work.
Mine probably flows out of that, and it probably flows in the same vein. Chris talked about athlete activism and then maybe professor activism, which I think is an awesome idea as somebody who's drawn a check from a university for most of the last quarter century. But I actually think that there could be a rebalancing if particularly in the states of the SEC footprint. I was just in Georgia, and Georgia hasn't changed its voting laws, or is talking about doing it in 2028 down the road at something. So the fact that there are substitutes, and I'm old enough to remember when kids from Mississippi went to the University of Pittsburgh and made that a powerhouse, or kids from Texas went to USC and changed the dynamic. So I could see that having a fundamental one, but I think it plays into another question. What would happen if a labor-oriented Democratic Congress, Democratic Senate, and Democratic president came along? And I don't even know if that's a black swan event. That might be a foreseeable one for two terms of a very labor-oriented Democratic presidency with an NLRB that moved along. Would we end up with athletes unionized kind of down the road? I still don't love unionism as a solution because I don't think it's the perfect one, and I don't think it helps quick enough. But I think that's the foreseeable one we're looking at, which is why almost all the legislation coming from the other side is no employment ever, no unionization ever, split that up. But I think that is still the one that is looming and probably on the other swing of the pendulum. Kelsey's comment, I think, really talks about it, the idea if they do exactly what Chris says and learn to sit out and threaten and use their power, which is the great power athletes have, and Kelsey says they start to use it politically and find substitutes, does that not create the big swing that we're talking about the other way? So I could see that. And I'm old enough. When I worked in the SEC was a try harder number two or number three. They since have become a dominant one, and but they're 3 years without a national champion in football, and it might be four, it might be five, and does that rebalance anything?
Barbara, do you have a black swan that we can kind of get you out on this? You don't? That's okay. I think
Not that I'm willing to talk about.
oh, that's fine. I think just for me, even though I wasn't asked, but I think I would add the current economic model of college sports that we're all, thank you, camera, that we're all arguing over here depends on the health of two particular other industries, right? The health of ESPN, Fox, and traditional broadcasters that are willing to pay escalating rights fees as the single biggest income source for everything, and the financial health of R1 land grant research institutions, elite private schools, and everyone who has an R1 Carnegie designation. If we had something, not necessarily another pandemic, but a highly disruptive labor event or economic event that challenged one of those two status quos, everything else blows up. If the next round of TV deals in 2031 are not able to give everybody another 20% raise, and there's only one bidder, that forces some extremely difficult financial conversations elsewhere, right? We know that there's a lot of schools in this country that are hurting through emissions, through failing state appropriations, through many other reasons, but it's mostly tuition dependent Bible colleges with 800 students, or regional schools in New Hampshire or Maine. If there's something changes where that begins to hurt Wyoming and begins to hurt North Dakota and South Carolina and Pitt, also changes everything, because you can't have college sports right now without high functioning universities. I think that's a good place to stop here. All right. That feels very Drake Group. We can't have college sports without healthy colleges. So let's push for those two. Thank you again, everybody, for taking the time and sharing your time and expertise with the panelists, and for all of the attendees that we have here in our group. We appreciate you coming. We appreciate your questions. There will be follow-up emails sent out later on. Thank you again for joining us. Be well, everybody.